In the next few seconds, you may suddenly realize that some of the deepest conversations you have ever had did not actually create closeness, but instead left you feeling drained, trapped, or strangely responsible for someone else's pain. This is because there is a crucial psychological difference between healthy vulnerability and trauma dumping, and most people confuse the two until the emotional damage has already been done. Both involve sharing pain, but only one builds connection, while the other quietly transfers emotional weight onto the listener without consent or containment. At first, trauma dumping can feel like intimacy, because intensity often masquerades as honesty. Someone opens up quickly, deeply, and graphically, and the rawness of the moment makes it feel real, important, and meaningful. But instead of leaving you feeling closer, you walk away feeling overwhelmed, emotionally hijacked, or responsible for fixing something you never agreed to carry. That discomfort is not a lack of empathy. It is your nervous system signaling that a boundary has been crossed. Healthy vulnerability invites connection, while trauma dumping demands emotional labor. The difference is not what is shared, but how, when, and why it is shared. Vulnerability is regulated, intentional, and responsive to the emotional capacity of the listener. Trauma dumping is unfiltered, urgent, and driven by the need to offload pain rather than process it. This distinction matters because repeated exposure to trauma dumping can quietly erode emotional safety in relationships. It turns conversations into emotional emergencies rather than mutual exchanges. People often excuse this behavior by saying that someone is just being honest or authentic. But authenticity without boundaries is not intimacy. It is emotional flooding. Trauma dumping often happens when a person has not yet learned how to self-regulate their emotional experiences. Instead of processing pain internally or with appropriate support, they release it outward in its rawest form. This release brings temporary relief to the speaker, but creates psychological strain for the listener. The relief comes from unburdening, not from understanding. Healthy vulnerability works differently. It involves sharing pain after some degree of reflection. The person knows what they feel, why they feel it, and what they are asking for, whether that is empathy, understanding, or simple presence. Trauma dumping skips this internal processing step entirely. The speaker may not know what they want from the listener beyond immediate emotional discharge. This creates confusion and pressure. The listener is pulled into a role they did not choose, often becoming a therapist, rescuer, or emotional container. What makes trauma dumping particularly tricky is that it often comes wrapped in sincerity. The pain is real, the emotions are valid, but the delivery is dysregulated. Healthy vulnerability respects pacing. Trauma dumping ignores it. One unfolds gradually as trust develops. The other floods instantly, often early in relationships or during moments of emotional instability. This is why trauma dumping can happen on first dates, in casual friendships, at work, or even with strangers. The lack of relational context is not accidental. It is a sign that the sharing is driven by internal urgency rather than mutual connection. People who trauma dump are often not trying to manipulate. They are trying to survive their own emotional overwhelm. But survival-driven behavior still has relational consequences. The listener's nervous system absorbs the intensity. Over time, this can lead to emotional fatigue, avoidance, resentment, or guilt. Many people stay silent about this discomfort because they fear being seen as cold, unkind, or unsupportive. This silence reinforces the pattern. The trauma dumper feels relief and assumes closeness has been created. The listener feels depleted and quietly withdraws. This mismatch slowly fractures relationships. Healthy vulnerability, by contrast, creates reciprocity. It leaves space for both people to breathe. It allows the listener to respond rather than react. The speaker remains emotionally present rather than dissociated or overwhelmed. One key difference lies in emotional regulation. Vulnerability occurs when emotions are felt but not overflowing. Trauma dumping occurs when emotions are spilling uncontrollably. This is why trauma dumping often includes graphic detail, circular storytelling, or repeated retelling of the same pain. The goal is not clarity, it is release. Healthy vulnerability does not require shock value. It does not overwhelm with detail to prove legitimacy. It trusts that the emotion itself is enough. Another difference lies in consent. Healthy vulnerability checks in, directly or indirectly. It asks, even silently, whether the listener has the capacity to hold this moment. Trauma dumping assumes availability. It bypasses consent entirely. The listener becomes an emotional dumping ground rather than an engaged participant. This is why trauma dumping often leaves people feeling trapped. There is no pause, no opening to respond, and no acknowledgement of the listener's emotional state. The conversation becomes one-sided and heavy. Importantly, trauma dumping is not defined by the severity of trauma. People can share profound trauma in healthy ways, and people can trauma dump over relatively small stresses. The difference lies in emotional containment. Healthy vulnerability includes boundaries around what is shared and how it is framed. It allows the listener to remain grounded. Trauma dumping pulls the listener into emotional chaos. This chaos can trigger unresolved issues in the listener, especially if they are empathetic or caretaking by nature. Over time, this creates unequal emotional roles. One person becomes the chronic sharer. The other becomes the emotional stabilizer. This imbalance feels like closeness at first, but it is unsustainable. Healthy relationships require shared emotional responsibility. Trauma dumping externalizes responsibility for regulation. Another subtle difference lies in timing. Healthy vulnerability emerges after some relational safety is established. Trauma dumping often ignores timing altogether. It arrives during moments of stress, crisis, or emotional overload, without regard for context. This unpredictability keeps the listener in a state of emotional vigilance. They never know when the next flood will come. This is why trauma dumping can feel invasive, even when intentions are good. It crosses internal boundaries rather than external ones. The listener may not know how to say no without feeling cruel, but emotional boundaries are not rejection. They are preservation. Understanding this distinction is crucial because labeling all emotional sharing as vulnerability discourages healthy boundaries. It teaches people to tolerate emotional overload in the name of compassion. But compassion without boundaries leads to burnout. Healthy vulnerability honors both people's nervous systems. It allows connection without collapse. Trauma dumping collapses emotional distance too quickly, creating intensity without safety. This is why trauma dumping often feels intimate but unstable. The bond is built on urgency rather than trust. As this pattern repeats, the listener may begin to associate the person with emotional exhaustion rather than connection. Avoidance grows, resentment simmers, guilt keeps the cycle going. The tragedy is that both people often feel misunderstood. The sharer feels abandoned. The listener feels used. Neither recognizes the real issue, which is not the trauma itself, but the way it is being shared. This misunderstanding prevents repair. To move forward, it becomes necessary to understand not just what trauma dumping looks like, but why it happens psychologically, how the nervous system drives it, and why some people repeatedly fall into the role of emotional container, which is exactly where this conversation must go next as we move into the deeper mechanisms behind trauma dumping and how to distinguish it clearly from healthy vulnerability in real time. As we move deeper into the psychology behind trauma dumping, the distinction becomes clearer when we examine what is happening inside the nervous system at the moment someone begins to share in an overwhelming way. Trauma dumping is rarely a conscious choice, because it is most often driven by a nervous system that is already overloaded and searching for immediate relief. When emotional pain exceeds a person's capacity to self-regulate, the body enters a state of urgency where expression feels necessary for survival. In this state, the goal is not connection, but discharge. The person is not asking to be understood. They are asking to feel less. Healthy vulnerability, by contrast, emerges from a regulated nervous system that can tolerate emotion without needing to escape it. This difference explains why trauma dumping often feels rushed, pressured, or emotionally chaotic. The speaker is not pacing themselves because their body does not feel safe slowing down. Their nervous system is in fight or flight, and talking becomes a way to release pressure. This is why trauma dumping can feel compulsive. Once it starts, it is difficult to stop. The words come out faster than they can be organized. The story loops. Details intensify. The speaker may jump from one painful memory to another without transition. This is not storytelling. It is nervous system overflow. People in this state are not attuned to the listener's reactions because their attention is turned inward toward emotional survival. Healthy vulnerability requires the opposite orientation. It involves awareness of the other person's presence, energy, and capacity. The speaker remains relationally engaged rather than internally flooded. This is why healthy vulnerability includes pauses, reflection, and responsiveness. The person notices whether the listener seems present or overwhelmed. They adjust accordingly. Trauma dumping lacks this adjustment because the nervous system cannot afford it. Attachment style plays a powerful role in this pattern. People with anxious or disorganized attachment are more likely to trauma dump, especially when they fear abandonment or emotional isolation. Sharing intensely becomes a way to secure closeness quickly. The logic is often unconscious and sounds like, if you know everything about my pain, you will stay. Unfortunately, this strategy often backfires. The intensity creates pressure rather than safety. The listener may feel trapped rather than bonded. People with avoidant attachment, on the other hand, are more likely to become the silent recipients of trauma dumping. They may not know how to interrupt or set boundaries without feeling cruel. They often withdraw emotionally instead, which reinforces the trauma dumper's fear of abandonment. This creates a painful loop where one person overshares to feel safe, and the other distances themselves to feel safe. Neither feels understood. The nervous system dynamics explain why trauma dumping is often followed by shame. Once the nervous system calms down, the speaker may realize they shared too much too fast. They may replay the conversation and feel exposed or embarrassed. This shame can lead to either withdrawal or even more trauma dumping. Withdrawal protects against exposure. More dumping attempts to regain connection. Healthy vulnerability does not produce this cycle because it is rooted in self-awareness rather than urgency. Another key difference lies in the expectation placed on the listener. Trauma dumping often carries an unspoken demand. The demand is not always advice or solutions. Sometimes it is emotional containment. Sometimes it is validation without limits. Sometimes it is rescue. The listener may feel responsible for making the pain stop. Healthy vulnerability does not impose this responsibility. It allows the listener to respond in their own way. The speaker does not collapse if the response is imperfect. They remain grounded in themselves. Trauma dumping collapses inward if the response does not meet the unspoken need. The speaker may escalate, become frustrated, or feel rejected. This reaction is not about the listener. It is about unmet regulation. One of the clearest markers of trauma dumping is repetition without integration. The same story is told again and again without new insight, reflection, or meaning. The emotional charge remains the same each time. Healthy vulnerability evolves. Each sharing brings greater understanding, language, and emotional resolution. Trauma dumping circles the wound without tending to it. This is why listeners often feel like nothing they say helps. Nothing helps because help is not the goal. Release is. Another important distinction is accountability. Healthy vulnerability includes ownership. The speaker acknowledges their emotions as their own. They do not blame the listener for how they feel. Trauma dumping often externalizes responsibility. The pain is placed into the listener's hands. If the listener becomes overwhelmed, the trauma dumper may feel abandoned or misunderstood. This reinforces the belief that no one can handle their pain. The pattern continues. It is important to understand that trauma dumping is not a character flaw. It is a sign of unmet support needs. Many people trauma dump because they have never been taught how to process emotions safely. They may have grown up in environments where emotions were ignored, punished, or overwhelming. Talking became the only release valve. Without tools for self-regulation, boundaries feel impossible. Everything comes out at once. Understanding this fosters compassion without requiring self-sacrifice. Compassion does not mean absorbing someone else's pain. It means recognizing its source. Healthy vulnerability is teachable. It involves learning how to pause, name emotions, and choose appropriate containers for deep sharing. It involves recognizing that not every relationship can hold every story. Trauma dumping often ignores context. It treats every listener as interchangeable. Healthy vulnerability is selective. It recognizes differences in capacity, role, and timing. This is why therapy exists. Some stories require professional containment. Friends and partners can support, but they are not meant to replace structured emotional care. Expecting them to do so creates imbalance. One of the most overlooked signs of healthy vulnerability is curiosity. The speaker remains curious about their own experience rather than fixed in it. They ask themselves why this hurts. They reflect on patterns. Trauma dumping is often rigid. The story is rehearsed. The meaning is fixed. There is no exploration, only expression. This rigidity signals that the nervous system is still stuck in threat mode. Healthy vulnerability allows movement. It allows growth. For listeners, understanding these mechanisms helps reduce guilt. Feeling overwhelmed does not mean you are unkind. It means your system is responding to overload. You are allowed to set boundaries without invalidating someone's pain. Boundaries are what make vulnerability sustainable. Without them, even the most well-intentioned connection collapses. As this understanding deepens, a crucial question emerges, which is how to respond in real time when trauma dumping begins. How to protect your emotional capacity without shaming the other person. and how to shift conversations toward healthy vulnerability instead of emotional flooding, which is exactly what must be explored next. As we move into the final section, where awareness turns into practical, relational skill, what ultimately separates trauma dumping from healthy vulnerability is not the depth of pain being shared, but the presence of awareness, because healthy vulnerability includes an understanding of impact, timing, consent, and emotional responsibility, while trauma dumping often bypasses all four in favor of immediate relief. Healthy vulnerability recognizes that emotional sharing is a relational exchange rather than an emotional release valve, which means the person sharing remains attuned to the emotional capacity of the listener, instead of unconsciously treating them as a container for unprocessed pain. Trauma dumping, by contrast, often happens when the nervous system is in a state of threat activation, because when the brain perceives emotional overwhelm, it prioritizes discharge over connection, leading the person to offload intense experiences without pausing to assess whether the other person is safe, willing, or resourced to receive it. This is why trauma dumping can feel chaotic, repetitive, or overwhelming to the listener, because the story being told is not organized by meaning or insight, but driven by raw emotional survival energy, seeking immediate release. Healthy vulnerability, on the other hand, tends to include reflection, boundaries, and intentionality, because the person sharing has moved at least partially out of survival mode and into integration mode, where the goal is understanding rather than evacuation. One subtle but powerful indicator of healthy vulnerability is the presence of choice, because the person sharing could stop, pause, or shift the conversation if they sense discomfort, while trauma dumping often feels compulsive, as if the story must be told regardless of the listener's reaction. This compulsive quality exists because trauma memories are stored differently in the brain, often fragmented and emotionally charged, and when triggered, they push themselves toward expression in order to reduce internal distress. However, without containment or consent, this expression can unintentionally recreate the original trauma dynamic, where boundaries were absent and emotional overwhelm was imposed rather than shared. This is why trauma dumping can leave both people feeling worse afterward, because the speaker may feel briefly relieved, but later ashamed or disconnected, while the listener may feel emotionally invaded, exhausted, or responsible for pain they never agreed to hold. Healthy vulnerability avoids this dynamic by respecting relational pacing, which means the speaker checks in with themselves and the listener, notices emotional intensity, and allows space for response rather than flooding the conversation with unresolved material. Another critical difference lies in the expectation placed on the listener, because trauma dumping often carries an unspoken demand for validation, rescue, or emotional regulation, while healthy vulnerability allows the listener to respond authentically without pressure to fix or absorb. This expectation is subtle but powerful, because when someone trauma dumps, the listener often feels trapped in the role of therapist, savior, or emotional stabilizer, even if they never consented to that responsibility. Healthy vulnerability, by contrast, treats the listener as a witness rather than a caretaker, which creates space for empathy without obligation and connection without emotional debt. The presence or absence of emotional boundaries is another defining factor, because healthy vulnerability includes an awareness of what belongs to the speaker and what does not belong to the listener. Trauma dumping often blurs this line, causing the listener to feel responsible for processing emotions that are not theirs, which can lead to resentment, burnout, or withdrawal over time. This is why relationships marked by chronic trauma dumping often experience sudden distancing or collapse, because the emotional imbalance becomes unsustainable even when care and compassion are present. Understanding this distinction is not about shaming people for sharing pain, because trauma dumping is not a moral failure, but a nervous system response shaped by unmet needs, unprocessed experiences, and a lack of safe outlets. Many people trauma dump because they were never taught how to share emotions in a regulated way, especially if they grew up in environments where emotions were ignored, dismissed, or punished until they erupted. In those contexts, emotional expression becomes all or nothing, either completely suppressed or released in overwhelming bursts when the internal pressure becomes unbearable. Recognizing this pattern allows for compassion without enabling harm, because it becomes possible to acknowledge pain while also setting boundaries around how and when it is shared. Healthy vulnerability often requires skills that were never modeled, such as asking for consent before sharing heavy topics, checking in during emotionally intense conversations, and taking responsibility for one's own emotional regulation. These skills are not intuitive for everyone, especially those with trauma histories, which is why learning them can feel uncomfortable or unnatural at first. However, developing these skills transforms relationships because it shifts emotional sharing from survival-based discharge to connection-based exchange. One practical shift that signals healthy vulnerability is framing emotional sharing around personal experience rather than graphic detail, because meaning builds connection while overwhelm breaks it. Another shift is recognizing when the urge to share is driven by anxiety rather than intention, because that urge often signals a need for grounding, containment, or professional support rather than immediate disclosure. Healthy vulnerability also includes the ability to tolerate silence, uncertainty, and incomplete understanding, because it does not rely on instant validation to feel legitimate. Trauma dumping, by contrast, often seeks immediate reassurance to soothe distress, which can create dependency patterns if repeated without growth or integration. This is why healthy vulnerability strengthens relationships over time, while trauma dumping often strains them despite good intentions. For listeners, recognizing the difference empowers them to respond without guilt, because setting boundaries around trauma dumping is not rejection, but self-protection. A healthy response may include redirecting the conversation, suggesting professional support, or expressing care while naming emotional limits, which preserves connection without sacrificing well-being. For speakers, learning to notice when sharing becomes overwhelming opens the door to deeper healing, because it shifts focus from release to integration. Integration occurs when experiences are processed with safety, pacing, and support, allowing emotions to be understood rather than simply expelled. This process often requires therapeutic spaces, journaling, or regulated conversations where consent and containment are explicitly established. When vulnerability is practiced this way, it becomes a bridge rather than a burden, because it invites closeness without coercion. The most powerful truth is that healthy vulnerability does not make relationships heavier, but lighter, because it replaces emotional flooding with mutual understanding. Trauma dumping often feels urgent because pain demands attention, but healthy vulnerability feels grounded because it trusts that connection does not require emotional collapse to be real. As awareness grows, people begin to recognize that not every emotion needs to be shared immediately, and not every listener is the right container for every experience. This discernment is not emotional suppression, but emotional maturity, because it honors both the self and the other. When people learn this distinction, they stop confusing intensity with intimacy and begin building relationships rooted in safety rather than survival. And once that shift happens, emotional sharing no longer feels like something that drains relationships, but something that deepens them, because it is guided by presence, respect, and choice, rather than urgency and overwhelm. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe for more practical psychology insights, self-awareness tools, and mind-sharpening advice. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.